Hello and welcome to our podcast. I'm Danny, and today we are talking with Regan Swanson, the Executive Director of the ArQuives. If you haven't heard of it, please do pay attention because this interview is going to be a little different from the others. The ArQuives work to aid in the recovery and the preservation of our queer history. But before we begin, remember, if you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. Now, hi, Regan, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I'm quite excited to talk about this. I think very often we cover the organizations that work with different issues, let's say, but history, preserving history is always, and very much now, I think, for our community, a very important matter, a very important issue. So, talking about history, let's begin first with the history of the ArQuives. Could you give us an overview of how it all began? How was the founding of this initiative?
Sure. I'm going to go back a little bit further. So in 1969, here in Canada, we had the very partial decriminalization of homosexuality. So it wasn't really decriminalized, and you can read all about that in the history books, but it really kind of galvanized folks in Toronto to kind of start forming the very first community groups here. And so 1969, we saw the very first one at the University of Toronto, the University of Toronto Homophile Association. And soon out of that group, a lot of little groups started popping up. And there was an awareness that events and activism were happening across the country. And in 1971, there was a publication that was formed called The Body Politic. Now, The Body Politic became Canada's very first significant and I'm going to call it gay publication because it was mostly run by white cis men at the time. So it was a gay publication that really covered all of Canada, and folks were sending material to the body politic offices to kind of inform community members about what was happening. Of course, this is pre-internet. We're still talking 1971. And there wasn't anywhere else to find this information. So the body politic really became like a placeholder for, where you can find information in some cases. And they had filing cabinets full of material. And by 1973, they realized we have basically started like a little archive in our collection. And we have nowhere to put it. There's nowhere it's gonna be safe. Like the government is not a safe space for it. The church is not a safe space for it. The university, archives are not a safe space for it. So community does what community does, and they created a safe space. So in 1973, the ArQuives was founded under the name the Canadian Gay Liberation Movement Archives. And we quickly became a site where people from across Canada and around the world could come and research and learn about LGBTQ2 plus history, specifically in Canada, but also kind of like around the world.
That is so nice to know because I I think once you start to really understand this history, how the process goes, one thing that becomes quite clear very quickly is the need of safe spaces, right? Of safe havens to not just live, which is like basic, but also to store these memories, because I think sometimes for a quite long time it was kind of feeble, right? Okay, we have these rights, but are we sure we have these rights? Can we really move forward with this?
Discrimination, and really, I think it's about who has control over the stories as well. So, the federal government in Canada fired employees from the RCMP, from the military, from top levels of the federal government for being gay and queer and trans right up until the 1990s. So really is even though, legal, same-sex marriage as it was called at the time, you've got marriage equality, you've got, the right to adopt, you've got these privileges that were handed to you by the oppressor. Are we really going to turn around and give our stories to them and say, we trust you now? And I don't know that, we should be in a spot to trust government when we have seen what happens, and we're seeing it every day, even right now in Canada, in the US, around the world. Um, Queer and trans rights are not enshrined in any sense or form. There is no guarantees. And so having a spot to have our histories and our stories preserved by community for community, I think that that's really the only way that we can ensure safety.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned this because I was going to ask you if we could discuss a little bit more about this importance of preservation of, and also about making it accessible to people. Because
Mhm.
when you mentioned, oh, maybe we could store it in churches, it's not safe, and universities, it was not safe. But then I thought, and it might not be easy to find either, because it's not everyone that can get, especially when we think about people that were segregated in so many different levels. So could you talk a little bit more about this, about from the work that you've been doing as an archivist archivist yourself, uh, the importance of keeping this space, of keeping this memory. What have you seen?
So I've worked at a whole bunch of different archives, kind of all from kind of middle of the country and east. I've worked in 4 different provinces, and the thing that keeps pulling me back and keeps exciting me the most is when communities are able to control their own narratives. So, it is really hard and really expensive to run an archive. You are never going to find an archive or a library, and in most cases, a museum that is going to make money. So a lot of times, even though these archives and spaces are created by community, it doesn't mean that they can carry on. Like the fact that we have reached 51 years is kind of a miracle. There is a lot of organizations that existed in the 1970s, 1980s, and even into the 90s that are now a part of government collections because they couldn't afford to pay the rent, the cost of living, the cost of storage space. I've got boxes behind me, I've got boxes at my feet. Storage space is a huge part of that. And so some of the keeping the story safe part is about, I feel like I might be going on a tangent here, but some of the thing about keeping the stories safe and keeping the stories accessible is that people feel safe coming into the space. And I think we struggle a little bit with it ourselves because not everybody understands what an archive is. They understand libraries, they understand museums to a certain extent, but an archive can kind of seen as like an institutional kind of barrier. That's a place for like professional researchers. It's a place for PhD students, maybe professors. It might not be a space for community. So I think that's one part that we've definitely struggled with to make sure that people feel like this is a space where they can come in and they can look at their own collections or they can look at the collections of their friends and the organizations that they were a part of. Because if you're not giving access to the material, then it's not really safe and it's not really existing for a reason. Like history should be alive. History should be something that we're in communication with all the time. It should inform the decisions we're making and help us understand like how decisions were made in the past. So I feel like I might have gone off on a tangent there, but yeah, like access and keeping it a community decision, I think is one of the key parts to making sure the collection is safe.
Oh, I think you did exactly what I wanted to hear, because it is about the community, right, and how it integrates within the community.
Mhm.
And since you mentioned this first difficulty of people really understanding what an archive is, and also talking about collections, I think I'm going to split this into bits. One is what kind of materials do you have there, like in your physical archives, and how can you collect them? How do you acquire and find ways to preserve it?
Sure. I'll start with the first one. So our mandate is to collect anything by and about LGBTQ2 plus Canadians, or people that live in Canada, or have made an impact on the life of Canadians. So we have collections that are from refugees and immigrants. It's not just, you had to be born here for your collection to be a part. Our collection is divided into four main collections, is what I like to say. So we've got a library collection with over 26,000 titles. That includes fiction, nonfiction, periodicals, monographs, zines, lots of zines. Yeah, I would say that a good chunk of our collection, I'd say about 98% of that library collection was all donated by community. So this isn't a library collection that is, that we've been piecing together. It is one that is like, okay, what were people buying? What were people like most interested in reading? The second part is our largest, which is the archive collection. So it's made up of personal foam, as we call them. So those are the collections that people create in the course of their lifetime. So you might have diaries or photographs, you might have correspondence. Uh, yeah, it's a little bit of everything. And then we've got organizational records. So community organizations, committees that were formed, their records that they created as they did community work have all come here. The third collection is artifact and artwork. So literally anything else that is 3D kind of fits into that category. We've got leather, we've got a board game collection, lots of matchbooks, pins, and t-shirts, tons of those, but also like sex toys and tiaras from pageants. We've got some gowns. We also have like more things that are a little bit more banal, like stamps and community objects, ephemera that have passed through hands, so flags. The last collection is kind of a reference collection. So before the internet, there was a lot of, well, what do you have on this person? Like, what do you know about this person? What do you know about this event or this organization? So we took non-primary source material and kind of created files on organizations or important events, and it was kind of used as a reference tool. So a lot of that is newspaper clippings. Most of that is newspaper clippings, honestly, but also a few other things thrown in. So that's our collections divide those four ways. So I already talked about the library mostly being donated. Actually, everything is mostly donated. So we don't really have a budget to be buying collections. I know some big university archives do that. They go and they offer, fancy artists lots of money to have their material. But our material is donated by community members. So it doesn't matter if they were a doctor, an activist, an artist. I'm just looking at the boxes around me for examples. Um, Sex workers, academics, authors, anybody and everybody has a story. And we are here to share that story because it absolutely was not being captured by any other organization well into the 1990s at a national level. And our organization is the National Archive. So everything is donated. When people pass away, they downsize, they have, in some cases, unstable housing because that's the reality of being queer and trans. We are able to take the material here and we offer an opportunity to make sure that the collection will be safe. And we've got 51 years now of experience on being able to kind of piece together a community organization that can do that work.
I love all these examples that you give, and I'm not using this word lightly here, because I think every object that we have in some level tells our story, right? Tells where we came from, what we could afford, the privileges we did or did not have, and the way that we see the world. So even simple things like stamps, they do tell a story, even though most people right now might not know what a stamp is. They did not know
I
how important they were.
I had to. explain to a student what matchbooks were when I had like a middle school come in, and I felt very old.
Oh
And
my
it
God.
was just kind of like a moment of, okay, this is a different world now.
Yeah, don't take it personally. Don't take it personally.
Yeah.
Don't take it personally. Just move forward. I feel the struggle. Now, Reagan, one other thing that in my research I noticed, and I thought it was really nice, is that you also have a digital part of this, right? You have a digital exhibition.
Yes,
How
we
does
do.
that work? Is this something that changes from time to time, or are you trying to establish it as just the digital version of the archive? How does it go?
So we will never be able to digitize everything that we have. And frankly, some of the stuff is not really anything that you would ever put up. When you go into a museum and you look at what's on exhibit, it's not the receipts for the like insurance for a building. Like it was important, but it's not going to go up on a gallery wall. And so we have to think about why we're digitizing things. So we digitize for two reasons. One is to protect the collection or the item to save it. Other, it's degrading or it will degrade faster because it's really high interest. So if it's being requested a lot, then, it's a good, if a photo is being requested a couple times a week or a month, we're likely going to digitize it because the likelihood of it getting damaged while it's being used by researchers is increased. So that's one reason that we digitize. The other reason we digitize is just simply for access. So our organization is a national organization. We have collections from across the country, and we have a physical location in Toronto. So really, a lot of the country is completely cut off from being able to physically access the building. In most cases, you would have to make your way to Toronto. So understanding that the national part of our mandate is important. It was about in 2016, I want to say, possibly earlier, the organization made a conceded effort to put more material online so that community members could have access to it. Now, some of that is so that you could see history, queer and trans history, like explicitly out there. We have a lot of students, especially I would say like 10 years ago that would come in and had no idea that there was trans elders that had stories and like had all these experiences. So many people felt like they were the first ones to ever feel like they did. This isn't a community you're born into. You have to go out and find it. But if you can't find it, you're pretty much alone. So by putting this online, by trying to show that queer and trans histories do exist, they're not completely erased by the mainstream history, like that community have worked to save its own history. That was one of the main reasons why we dedicated time to digitize material and put it online. Today, we've got about 26 exhibits, maybe a little bit more, but we're just adding to them on a regular basis, and we've committed to adding more digital content. And as more material comes in and it's already digital, it's easier to do those things. We don't have to sit down and scan hundreds of photos to put into an exhibit. We can just be like, oh, look, here's all these beautiful digital like items, and we can create something or work with students to create something because a lot of them are done by interns from universities across the country. So it's really a great opportunity to showcase our collection to make sure community sees, well, not just our community, that the general public understands that queer and trans histories exist, that we have our own narrative here in Canada that, is obviously influenced by the United States and what was going on in Europe, but is still distinct. And it is a place for community members to see themselves represented. And so that's really hopefully we'll be able to do more, but anything digital is always more expensive at this time. So it's a delicate balance of what can we manage without overextending ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of always of priorities, right? You need to really find, as I said, the balance between one, fulfilling this need, this desire to get people more involved in a level and get information to them with the need of preserving materials that will deteriorate, but also how can we keep things moving forward? And with
Yeah.
that, I'm going to use it to ask you for the listeners, either individuals or organizations that got interested about this, then that would like to help the archives keep moving forward. What would be the best ways to help you guys?
So many ways, so many ways. So we have lots of volunteers, and a lot of them exist outside of Toronto, especially since 2020, when a lot more people have been volunteering online. We have about 100 volunteers right now and a waiting list that exists for people who want to come in. But volunteering is one way. Um, Financial donations have always been key. So our entire operating fund, like everything operating fund, is paid for by LGBTQ2 plus community members. We don't accept any government or institutional funding at an operation level. We accept it for project grants, but we don't want anyone to take the decision making away from us, which a lot of times operational funding can happen. So, you know, tossing us a few bucks does make a difference. It helps pay the rent and keep the lights on and, the heat going in the winter and the air conditioning in the summer. Another way is by donating collections. So we rely on community members to, you know, keep history kind of going by making sure they're thinking about where they're putting their stuff. And so sometimes that might be their books, sometimes it might be the photographs they've taken. And it's remarkable how much time we have to spend convincing people that their collections are important, that, the photographs of them and their friends, of them and their chosen family, of them and their biological families, the letters that they wrote, the postcards, all of that. We're really, it's kind of sad that we have to spend time convincing people that their collection matters and deserves a place in an institution like ours. But it does, and there is a place. And if it's not in our institution, it probably will fit somewhere else. And so think about where your history is going and who's going to tell your story and your family story. And then the last way is to just use the resources. So we've got researchers that come from around the world that make requests online, that look at our material online, that listen to oral histories and videos that we've made or that we've collected. And using the collection is a way to support us because it shows that people are listening to LGBTQ2 plus stories in Canada, and it gives us a reason to continue to exist.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Regan, for joining us today and for teaching us all these things. I think it's super vital, and I do hope that more people get engaged, get involved with the archives. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And for everyone watching or listening, also thank you for staying with us for this more episode. And remember how it goes. If you liked it, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app because this helps us spread the word about the importance of the archives. Bye. And I see you in the next episode. Oh, and one more thing before I go. We're going to find the link to their webpage on the description of this episode, all right? So there's no excuse to not get in touch and to not learn a little bit more. Now, bye. And I see you in the future.